The town of Bell River was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. Nestled deep in the Appalachian hills, it existed quietly. All creaky porches, chipped paint, and secrets. The creek that gave the town its name wound lazily behind the schoolhouse and through the trees before widening into a stagnant pool near the edge of the forest. That was where the girl had been found. It was Sheriff Alvin Rusk who discovered her, early one cold morning in November. He hadn't been looking for anyone. He just liked to walk near the water with his thermos of bitter coffee before the town began to wake. But that morning, the mist was heavier, the silence heavier still. And in that hush, he saw her, standing waist deep in the black water, hair slick against her pale face, eyes wide open. She didn't speak when he called out. She didn't move when he splashed toward her. When he reached her, she was ice cold but alive. There were no bruises, no marks, no blood. She looked about 10 years old, wearing what might have once been a nightgown, now stained green with algae, and clinging to her thin frame like a second skin. Back at the sheriff's office, she still said nothing. The town doctor declared her healthy, but in shock. The social worker from Beckley was called, but wouldn't arrive until the next morning. So she stayed the night in the back room, wrapped in a quilt, with Sheriff Rusk sitting nearby, watching the rise and fall of her breath. The townsfolk were curious, of course. Bell River hadn't had anything close to excitement since the mining accident in '84. But as word spread about the silent girl, folks began to whisper a different kind of story. Old May Crenshaw swore she'd seen the girl before, 50 years ago, when she was just a child. Said her name had been Evie or Edie or something like that, and she'd drowned in that very creek. Others nodded solemnly, as if remembering too. A name passed around. Elsbeth Crow, a girl from a family that no longer lived in Bell River, a family that had left under strange circumstances. Some folks said the Crows had dealings with things best left alone, that they'd stirred up something dark that still hung over the woods. But that was nonsense, Rusk thought. This was a girl, flesh and blood, who needed help. And yet, that night, as the wind howled and rattled the windows, she began to hum. It was a low, warbling tune, off-key and old, like something from another time. It stopped Rusk cold. It wasn't just eerie. It was familiar. His grandmother had sung that song, sitting on the porch with her pipe long ago. He hadn't heard it since he was a boy. He leaned in close, whispering, "What's your name, honey?" Her eyes opened slowly, black as the creek water. "I'm where I belong," she whispered, and then she smiled. It wasn't the smile of a child. It was something older, something that remembered, something that had waited a long, long time. The smile stayed fixed on her face for just a moment before slipping away, replaced by the blank, hollow expression she had worn when she first arrived. Sheriff Rusk sat back in his chair, a cold shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the drafty old building. The hum had stopped, and she closed her eyes again, as if nothing had happened. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat with the radio crackling low beside him, flipping through old case files in the dim light. There was no file on an Elsbeth Crow, nothing in the official record. But he remembered the name. His mother had mentioned the Crow family once in a hushed conversation after church, said they'd had a strange daughter, the kind who saw things, heard voices, said things no child should know. By sunrise, the girl was awake again, still silent, still staring. When the social worker arrived, a tired-looking woman in a tan coat named Miss Carter, she took one look at the girl and frowned. "Has she said anything?" she asked Rusk. He hesitated. "Only once. Said she's where she belongs." Carter pursed her lips. "Sounds like a trauma case. Could be dissociation. You'll need to get her evaluated at the state facility." Rusk nodded, but something gnawed at him. He didn't want her to leave Bell River, though he couldn't explain why. Still, protocol was protocol. They loaded her into the social worker's car and watched them disappear down the road toward Route 19. She was gone less than 3 hours. At 11:46 a.m., Rusk got the call. The car had crashed, no other vehicles involved, just off the side of the road near Briar Hollow, twisted into a tree. Miss Carter was dead on impact. The girl was nowhere to be found. The deputy found her 2 hours later. Not in the woods, not at the hospital. Back in the same creek, standing waist deep again in the dark water, exactly where she'd been found the first time. This time, her hair was dry, her dress was clean, and she was smiling. They brought her back again, and this time, Rusk didn't call anyone. He sat across from her in the station and tried to make sense of it. "Who are you?" he asked. She tilted her head. "You already know." "No, I don't. I want to help you." Her fingers toyed with the frayed edge of the quilt. "You can't help what's already started." "What do you mean?" Her eyes locked on his. "They never left, you know. The ones that took me. They just sleep beneath." Rusk felt a tremor in his stomach. "Beneath what?" She looked toward the floor. "Beneath the roots. Beneath the town. They whisper through the trees when the air gets cold. You've heard them, haven't you?" He swallowed hard. He had heard things in the woods, strange, low murmurs on nights when the wind stopped. But he had always blamed it on his own nerves. Old houses settling, deer moving through the brush. Now, hearing her say it, it all came back. The nights he dreamed of eyes watching from under the water, the stories his grandfather told him about the sleepers in the soil. Rusk sat back in his chair, unsure of what to say. The girl didn't press him. She closed her eyes again and began humming that same old melody. That night, Bell River changed. Dogs barked at nothing. Lights flickered. A deep, grinding noise echoed through the hills, like the earth itself groaning. People stayed indoors. The preacher's wife claimed she saw black shapes moving between the trees at the edge of her yard. Old May Crenshaw said her dead brother stood at her window, tapping the glass with rotting fingers. And in the station, Rusk sat with the girl as the floorboards vibrated beneath their feet. "Elsbeth," he whispered, the name like ash on his tongue. She opened her eyes. "They're waking up," she said, "and they remember you." The air in Bell River grew heavier in the days that followed, as if the atmosphere itself thickened with dread. People began to vanish. First, it was a pair of teenage boys who'd gone hiking near the edge of Briar Hollow. Then it was Father Grady, the town's priest, who never showed up for morning mass. His rosary beads were later found in a neat circle at the foot of the Whispering Tree. Sheriff Rusk stopped sending his deputies out alone. The girl, Elsbeth, as he now called her, remained in the back office of the station, calm and motionless, like she was waiting for something to arrive. She no longer hummed. She just listened. Sometimes her eyes would track movements that no one else could see, following invisible shapes across the ceiling or down the hallway. One night, as Rusk dozed off in the chair beside her, she spoke. "You should leave," she said. Her voice was low but firm. He startled awake. "Leave where?" She turned toward the window, where the moonlight cut across the floor like a silver blade. "The woods have opened. The hollow is breathing again. It remembers you." "I've never been in that place," Rusk said. "Not since I was a kid." "But you were there," she replied, turning back to him. "You saw the bones." His blood ran cold. He had almost forgotten about that day. He was 9 years old. He and his cousin had gone into Briar Hollow on a dare, trying to find the old foundation where the Crow cabin used to be. They found it, half sunk into the ground, black stones covered in lichen. And in the basement, they had found a pit. Bones. So many bones, twisted together, some animal, some not. They had run screaming back to town, but when the adults arrived, the pit was gone. Nothing but earth and old roots. Rusk had never spoken of it again. Neither had his cousin, who later hanged himself in the barn at 16. Rusk sat motionless. "What is happening, Elsbeth?" She looked him dead in the eyes. "They're calling their children home." That same night, a sinkhole opened up in the center of town. It swallowed the old bakery and most of Main Street. Witnesses described hearing something before it happened, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from underground. The earth buckled like it was breathing, and then collapsed. Rusk stood at the edge the next morning, staring down into the hole. It wasn't natural. The walls were smooth, almost carved. Symbols were etched into the clay, spirals and crooked crosses, half faded. And there was something down there. Something that moved just beyond the reach of the light. When he returned to the station, Elsbeth was gone. No sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no footprints. Just a note written in a child's uneven scrawl, left on the desk where she used to sit. "He waits under the roots. He waits with my face." Rusk didn't sleep for 2 days after that. Bell River began to empty. Some people packed up and left quietly in the night. Others went missing. A group of children was found standing in a perfect circle in the woods, their eyes rolled back, hands joined, murmuring in a language no one could recognize. When one of the deputies tried to pull them apart, he started bleeding from his ears and collapsed. He hasn't spoken a word since. That's when the dreams began. Rusk saw her in them, Elsbeth, standing by the whispering tree, her face pale and wet with black tears. Behind her, something stirred. A great shape with no eyes, its body made of roots and bone, crawling slowly up from the soil. He woke each time with the taste of mud in his mouth. Then, on the seventh night, he found her again. She was back at the creek. But this time, she wasn't alone. 12 children stood behind her, hand in hand, barefoot and silent, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And at her feet, buried up to the neck in wet earth, was something that looked like a man, but wasn't. Its skin was pale and stretched like old wax. Its mouth was sewn shut with thorns, and its eyes were empty, deep, black voids that pulled light into them. Around its neck, a collar of knotted vines pulsed like a second heartbeat. Elsbeth looked up at Rusk as he approached. "He remembers your name," she said. The thing in the ground began to tremble, and from the woods around them, the earth began to whisper. The whispers grew louder with every step Sheriff Rusk took toward the circle of children. They weren't whispers in any language he understood, more like 1,000 dry leaves rustling in unison, speaking through wind and shadow. His boots crunched the brittle undergrowth, but none of the children turned. They stood, rooted, as if part of the forest now. Elsbeth was at the center, unmoving. The creature at her feet, the not man, was beginning to rise. The earth peeled back around its shoulders, revealing a torso stitched with bark and blood. Its ribs weren't bone, but twisted branches, and something glistened between them like a pulsing heart of moss and flame. Sheriff Rusk gripped the crucifix around his neck, but even that felt cold and useless. Elsbeth's voice came again, quiet but deafening. "You left them to rot." Rusk's jaw tightened. "I was a child. I didn't know what I saw." "But you knew it was real." She stepped forward now, the children behind her parting silently as if guided by one mind. She was barefoot, her dress wet with black mud that trailed like ink behind her. Her eyes, once vacant and distant, now burned with an ancient fury. "You walked away from their cries, from the pit, from the roots." Her voice trembled. "And now the hollow walks in you." He shook his head. "No, I've lived my life protecting this town. I did everything I could." She pointed toward the not man rising behind her. "He remembers." The creature's head turned slowly, cracking like frozen wood. And in that face, stretched and wrong, Rusk saw something familiar. A memory not quite his own. A man being dragged into the pit, fingers clawing at the stones, his voice lost in the wind. It was his father. Or someone wearing his father's face. "No," Rusk whispered. Elsbeth reached out and took his hand. The forest fell silent. "You must go back," she said. "You must go down, or it will come up." The ground beneath the creature split further, revealing a black tunnel spiraling deep into the hollow. The air that rose from it was cold and fetid, like the breath of something that had waited too long. Rusk looked around. The children had vanished. Only Elsbeth remained. And the creature, now fully unearthed, stood at the threshold of the hole, still waiting. "What's down there?" Rusk asked. Elsbeth tilted her head. "The first ones." She turned to the tunnel and began to descend without another word. Rusk hesitated, then followed, the shadows swallowing him inch by inch. The deeper they went, the more the walls around them changed, from dirt to stone, from stone to something that pulsed. Symbols glowed faintly in the rock, spirals, hands, teeth. Sounds began to rise, screams too old to be remembered, weeping, laughter, broken and wrong. At the bottom was a chamber. It was vast, domed, lit by flickering flames that burned without source. The roots of the whispering tree pierced the ceiling and hung like tendrils, dripping black sap. And there they stood, the first ones. They were not human, but they had once worn human faces. Their bodies were long and spindled, wrapped in tattered remnants of flesh and fur. Their eyes were hollow, and their mouths open not to speak but to sing. The hymn was terrible, a low, droning dirge that vibrated in Rusk's bones. He dropped to his knees, clutching his ears. Elsbeth stood tall beside him. "You buried them, but they remember." Rusk opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was lost in the song. The first ones began to circle him, dragging behind them chains made of roots and old bone. One held a mask, a perfect replica of Rusk's face, carved in pale wood. Another held a crown of antlers, slick with blood. Elsbeth leaned close. "You were always meant to return." Then the mask was pressed to his face, and everything went dark. When Sheriff Rusk opened his eyes again, he wasn't himself. He stood beneath the whispering tree, its branches twisted high into a night sky that had no stars. The air smelled of wet leaves and old secrets. His hands, no longer aged and trembling, were young, clean. He looked down and saw boots too big for his feet, a lantern in his grasp. He knew this moment. It was the night he'd wandered into the woods as a boy. But it was different now. Time had curled in on itself, folding the past into the present. He wasn't reliving the memory. He was trapped in it. A voice called behind him. "Danny, you coming or not?" It was Ellis, his cousin, grinning through crooked teeth, the light from his lantern bouncing off his muddy cheeks. Behind him, the other kids were gathering by the pit. Rusk's stomach turned. He remembered what was down there, the dare, the fall, the screaming. He remembered leaving. This time, he walked forward. Each step was agony. His mind screamed against the choice, the same choice he had run from decades ago. But his feet moved, driven by something older than guilt, older than regret, a tether that had pulled him back here, to the hollow. The pit gaped open before them, dark and silent. "Go on, then," Ellis said, nudging him. 10 minutes down and back up. You want to be one of us, don't you?" Rusk stared into the dark. This time, he jumped. The fall was fast, violent. Not down, but through, as if diving into layers of memory and blood. When he landed, it wasn't into dirt. It was into water, black and freezing. He thrashed, kicked upward, broke the surface, and gasped. He was in the chamber again, the one beneath the forest. The first ones were gone. Only Elsbeth remained, seated on a stone throne covered in vines. Her eyes glowed faintly, and she was older now, ancient, ageless. "You chose it," she said softly. "You didn't run." Rusk tried to speak, but his voice was raw, cracked. What happens now?" Elsbeth stood and walked to him. She touched his face, gentle, almost maternal. "You become the hollow." The roots in the ceiling began to twitch, writhing like snakes. One of them slithered down and wrapped around Rusk's arm. Another coiled at his ankle. He panicked. No, I can't." But Elsbeth was already stepping back. "It's not punishment. It's memory. Someone must carry it." His scream echoed through the chamber as the roots pierced his skin, that burrowing beneath. Visions flooded him. Every lost soul taken by the hollow, every secret buried under dirt and lies. He saw the children who had vanished over generations. He saw the faces of those who had heard the tree whisper and never returned. And he saw himself in every one of them. When the pain faded, he stood, taller now, wrapped in shadow and bark. His body was no longer his own. His eyes glowed like coal. He was the new guardian. The hollow had its voice. Elsbeth bowed her head, then faded into mist, her purpose fulfilled. Above ground, in the forest that never slept, the whispering tree shivered. Its branches twisted into new shapes, its bark darkening with fresh memory. And when children dared too close, the wind would speak in a voice rough with roots and time. Turn back. Because now Sheriff Daniel Rusk was the warning in the wind, and the hollow remembered everything.